Hello and welcome to this talk about the Logie housing scheme in Dundee. My name is Sarah Aitken and I'm the Assistant Archivist at Dundee City Archives. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the background of Logie, which was the first council housing scheme in Scotland after the First World War. And the reason why I'm talking to you about this is that this year, in 2020, marks the 100th anniversary of Logie being opened back in 1920. So let's just start the slides. Okay, so here we go. So this is just a picture of what the Logie housing scheme looks like today. In case you don't know, I'm just going to go through a bit of where Logie is. So this is a modern day map of the west end of Dundee. You can just see Perth Road along the bottom here. We've got the Market Gate in pink, which runs into Logie Road. We've also got Blackness Road and Brook Street, the main roads to the area. And the Logie estate is this area circled in red. The name Logie was what the corporation named the housing estate, but the name was derived from the parish which existed in this area until the 17th century, and there have been various things named Logie in this area. So there's a church named Logie. The main estate in the area owned by the Scott family was also called Logie, and we'll come on to that in a bit. The Logie housing estate was close to the Blackness Road area of industry, which this sort of area down here. There were a lot of works, and the Blackness foundry, of course, was there. So that would mean that there were lots of jobs for the people who lived in the Logie area to work in. To give you an idea of what it was like before Logie was built, this is an Ordnance Survey map from 1902. Again, we can see Perth Road along the bottom. We've got the Hawk Hill, the Skirring Burn, or later become Brook Street, and we've got Logie Road up here. This is our area for Logie. As you can see, there's nothing there back then. There are a few tenements on Blackness Road and a few on Scott Street, but very much this is kind of the outer limits of what Dundee was back in the 1910s, 1900s. So very much the suburbs of Dundee. So first of all, I'm going to take you back to a rather rainy day in July 1919. In the field in the west of Dundee, a group of men have gathered with their umbrellas and their shovel, and they are preparing to break ground at the Logie site. And with their shovel, they're about to begin the first council housing funded scheme in Scotland. At the time, Dundee was actually the third largest city in Scotland, so we were bigger than Aberdeen at the time, and it may come as a surprise, certainly it did to me, that the first post-war council housing scheme was actually in Dundee and not in one of the largest cities. So what I'm going to do is we're going to have a look back as to see why this was. So let's take a look at what Dundee was like in the start of the 20th century. This, for example, is a view of the area that was behind the Adam Town House. So this area is now roughly the city square area. Many of the tenements in this area, like elsewhere in the city centre, were tall, they were close together, they were poorly ventilated, they were dark, and they were probably quite damp. A bit closer to where Logie was is the Hawk Hill area. This is the rear of 58 Hawk Hill. For those of you who know that area, this is the old Hawk Hill now, of course, and it's the area between Smalls Wynd and Park Wynd, and is now actually occupied by the Army Cadet Base. You can also see how close the houses are together. There's more outbuildings out the back, and the big chimney in the middle shows you that it's just across the road from the Heathfield Works on the other side of the Hawk Hill. As for the inside of these tenements, this is an example of a home on the Overgate. This is 39 Overgate. This was actually taken in 1920, so a bit later, and it shows you a room in a very small part, maybe a 1 or 2 roomed flat. And this is possibly the kitchen. You've looked at something which looks like a range on the left there, just behind the gentleman we don't know for sure, but either way, it doesn't look like a very healthy or safe place to live. The problems with the housing in the city and the general conditions of the working classes were really highlighted in Dundee thanks to the Dundee Social Union and their report of 1905 into housing and industrial conditions, and this is the front page here. It's a really interesting report, and you could do a whole talk on it just alone. I'm sure someone probably has done in the past. What I'm going to do is just run through a few of the main key statistics and information which was uncovered in the report that highlighted the problems in Dundee. Firstly, the infant mortality rate the year before in 1904 was the highest rate in any city in Scotland. It was 174 per thousand live births, which was significantly higher than Glasgow and Edinburgh. Of the families that were surveyed as part of the report, over a third of the children that they had in the family had died. So not just infant mortality was children dying under the age of 2. This is children as a whole dying. So a third of children who had been born to these families had died. 49.2%, so just under half of the people surveyed, were living more than 2 persons per room. That's not bedroom, that's any room in the house. So a kitchen wouldn't count, but a large room which you were using for sleeping in or living would count as a room. So a 1 room would be a bed set, a 2 room would be a 1 bed flat, and so on, so on. As you can see from the table at the bottom of the screen, Dundee had the highest proportion of 3-roomed homes and under at 88.4%, whereas Glasgow was just slightly less at 86.3%, and then you have Aberdeen and Edinburgh at the bottom. Dundee also has the highest percentage of 2-roomed homes as well, although Glasgow did have more 1-room homes in total. The average population density in Dundee was 39.4 persons per acre. One property that was surveyed as part of the report had 177 people living in it, but there was absolutely no toilet facilities provided, not even an outdoor toilet, as most toilets would have been at this time. The average size of a room in the property surveyed was 1,005 cubic feet. Now, to give you an idea, at this point, the recommended height for rooms in tenant buildings was 9 feet high. So this means that the rooms themselves would have been 10.5 feet squared. And on average, in homes in Dundee, there was only 1 toilet per 6 houses, regardless of how many people lived in them. So if the 6 houses were 2 or 3 rooms, you're possibly looking at 40, maybe even 60 people per toilet. So these statistics, we'll have a look at a couple of areas in more detail. So these statistics are actually from just after the war in the early 1920s, so about the time that Logie was being built and people were moving in. So the Overgate area was a well-known, probably what we would call slum. The housing there wasn't particularly good, and they were very close together. You can see that the death rate is almost twice as much as it is over the whole city, at 26 persons per 1,000. The deaths from TB and other pulmonary deaths is just slightly higher, but it's only 1 person per 1,000. However, you can see that the infant death rate is much higher. The picture on the left is actually another picture of 39 Overgate, so possibly where that elderly couple slept. Although the cat actually looks quite healthy. And on the right-hand side, we can see St Salvador's Close, which was just off the Overgate. That, if you're interested, would now run through the middle of New Look in the Overgate Centre. So it wasn't just the very centre of Dundee. There was also quite a notorious area known as the Blue Mountains. I'm sure many of you, if you know a bit about Dundee history, will know this area. And that's this area that's circled in blue here. Just beyond the Westport and just off the Hawk Hill and the Scurringburn or Brook Street, as it was later known. The statistics were even worse for the Blue Mountains area. So we're up from 26 to 28 persons per 1,000 dying. the TB rates is much higher. So we've got 4 rather than 1, and the infant death rate is even higher than the rate that it was in 1904, which was 174, and we're up to 182 here. The 2 pictures below show you the general idea of what the buildings were like here. They weren't necessarily as high as some of the ones we've seen, but they were quite close together and generally quite poor. As you can see on the one on the right, that's the standpipe where people would get their water. And I don't know if there are any toilet facilities here. I don't know if that's what those doors are. But either way, it's difficult to see in black and white how dirty something is, but I imagine it probably is quite dirty. So what could the council do about these poor conditions? Various acts had been passed to allow councils to build housing, but it was only a voluntary act and in general was aimed at London councils. Some building had taken place elsewhere in the country, but it had been on a small scale. It was only an option and not compulsory for councils to build housing for the working classes in their areas. The council could close, demolish or compulsory purchase insanitary homes if they were deemed a nuisance to public health or even the health of the people who were living there. And this action really grew apace in the 1910s, just before the war. So really the first discussion of the council building homes was in 1907. The Stirling Park area you can see on the map here was the prime location suggested. Okay, so there were allotments already on the ground, but the area was on the side of the law, so it was south-facing. It was close to the industry off the hill town and was away from the smoke of the city. But as usual, a few things got in the way. Well, there were allotments already there, but the issue was because it was what they called hospital ground, they didn't know if legally they could build on the land, and also the age-old problem, money. It would cost money to build homes. So the council decided just to develop land, build roads, and hope that the private builders would fill in the gap in the market. But fast forward 7 years to 1914, unfortunately things aren't much better, so the council discusses the issue again. The sanitary inspector had closed lots of houses in the last 7 years, and work was underway to demolish the vaults, the area that we saw in the second slide. So a lot of homes were being closed down or demolished. Private enterprise had really stopped building because it wasn't cost effective for them, and the war had just started, so they weren't allowed to. It was estimated that 70% of homes in Dundee was 1 or 2 rooms, so it had grown since the 1905 report, and that's much higher than the 53% average across the whole of Scotland. It was suggested that new homes should be provided for those displaced by the Central Improvement Scheme to build the Caird Hall in City Square, but eventually this was rejected. It was also reported by the council that schemes that were built in some council areas in England had resulted in an increase to local rates. And of course, the raising of taxes is never a popular idea. So the council just decided to focus on closing insanitary homes and dealing with the congested areas in the city centre. However, they did ask the city engineer, James Thompson, to prepare a report on the types of houses that they could build and investigate plots of lands they could buy for less than 1 shilling per pole, which is a measurement of land in case you don't know. But ultimately, they decided to not make any decisions until after the war, which I'm sure at the end of 1914 they probably thought was going to be a lot sooner than what it was. But the war went on, went past Christmas 1914, and a couple of years later in 1916, the housing issue became not just a problem in Dundee, it was a problem across the whole of the country. In April 1916, there were discussions about central government providing funding for building homes, and the city engineer was ordered to investigate the cheap land once again. Towards the end of the year, James Thompson remarked that housing had become an extreme importance to Dundee and must not be done half-heartedly. So he knew the importance of building new homes and that they needed to make a good job of it and not just provide cheap housing to the workers of Dundee. So finally, the following year, the spring following year, Thompson produces his report on housing. He stated that it had been generally recognised that in the industrial centres, housing had become imperative. There was a need to improve housing for working classes and to provide work for men returning home from the war. According to the 1911 census, the population of Dundee was 165,000. And they'd estimated in the 6 years since the census, the population had grown by 7,000 to 172,000. So the population was growing at quite a fast pace. In almost the same amount of time, since 1912, 456 houses had been closed, 605 were demolished to make way for the Caird Hall. And as part of the central improvement scheme, more were going to be demolished in the same area. Meanwhile, only 23 houses for the poorer working classes had been built. It was estimated that there were 80 homes per acre in Dundee, and the aim was to get this down to 20 per acre. So we're reducing it to a quarter of the current rate. So that's quite an aim. Building new homes would give work for men returning home from the war, and would provide the aim was to provide more houses for the working classes. As part of Thompsons Report, 3 possible locations were highlighted. There was Stirling Park, which had been originally considered in 1907, Logie, and an area they called Spring Hill. Each was close enough so that people could walk to work. The aim was then within 1,000 yards radius of the centre of industries within the city. So let's have a look at the 3 different options in 1917. This is the plan of Dundee at the time, so it gives you a rough idea of the layout of the city. And you can see each of the 3 different options marked in red. So we have Stirling Park, Spring Hill, and Logie in the west. Stirling Park was the one originally considered in 1907, but there were still the same problems there was then, and there were still allotments on the ground, and there were legal issues over where they could build on hospital ground. Spring Hill, which was bound between Arbroath and Broughty Ferry Road, was either the current or former site of large grand houses owned by the industry owners of the city. So we had Ellengown, which was occupied by members of the Baxter family, Thornbank and Taybank. The site itself, which they had earmarked, was 31 acres in size, but the problem was that there were 5 different owners to negotiate with over getting the land. Finally, there was Logie in the west. It was only 20 acres, but it was only owned by 1 owner, so it could be a lot easier to negotiate over. Each plot of land was near a park or a green place. Victoria Park for Logie, the Law for Stirling Park, and Baxter Park for Spring Hill. They were each also close to the areas of industry of the city. Logie was close to the Blackness industrial area. The hill town was close to Spring Park, and also we had the docks near Spring Hill. Thompson did state in part of his report that they needed a desirable departure from the old style of housing in Dundee. He didn't want to build more tenements, he'd rather build a new style of housing for the working classes. Houses would be further apart, only 2 stories high, and would let sunlight in and have no outbuildings, but they would have a garden. Wash houses and communal baths would be provided in separate buildings. And this perhaps shows what was popular in the 1920s, but it was also important that bowling greens were nearby. The houses were also meant to be near day nurseries so that working parents could get childcare they needed. So this is the original design suggested by Thompson that the new houses could be. In the end, they only did 1 bed and 2 bedroom homes. They didn't do any bed sits, as we would call them now. But this was the original plan. So type A is what they would call a 1-roomed home, type B is a 2-roomed home, and type C is a 3-roomed home because the living room counts as a room. So type A was supposed to be suitable for a single woman or 2 single women sharing, or even a widow. Type B was for married couples just starting a family, so with 1 or 2 children. And then type C was for a married couple with a larger family, so 3, 4 plus children. Within the kitchen, there were a number of features, including a gas cooker, a dresser, a sink, a coal bunker, a press, and a water closet. Yes, they had planned to put a toilet in the kitchen, which seems very odd to us. I'm not sure if it was a popular thing at the time. I'm sure indoor toilets were still quite a novelty. Maybe someone else can provide the answer for that. The aim was to build suburban cottages, the style homes for artisans, so what we would probably call the upper working classes or the lower middle classes. The idea was that by creating better homes, everyone would move up the ladder. So the upper working classes would move into these cottage-style houses, and then the lower working classes would move into the better style tenements, and you would close down and destroy the slum tenements of the Blue Mountains and the Overgate area. So as part of Thompson's report, he said that to get public consultation, he would build a scale model of these homes. And they did that, and they put them up in Dundee Park. And in the first week, they had well over 19,000 visitors in 9 days during the summer of 1917. Just to give you a perspective, that's around 11% of the population of Dundee at the time. And by December, this had climbed to well over 64,000. I don't know if that includes people going back and forth several times. Either way, it shows that it was a very popular site. And within the first week or so, we'd also had 132 people hand in marked cards saying that they would be interested in getting one of these houses if they were available to rent. There were a few comments about the homes. The first one, the main one, was the size of the rooms. People thought they weren't big enough. People also remarked the fact that there were no shelves, that there were no lobbies, that they weren't big enough. There was no hand basin, no back door, and no bathtubs. As we've already seen, this was part of Thompson's plan to have separate bathing facilities. A main criticism was that the coal bunker was in the kitchen, which would mean that the coalman had to go through your best room to get to the coal bunker, which is quite sensible if you think about it. You don't want somebody trailing in coal dust all over your nice clean living room. There were no corridors between the rooms, they all just led off each other. One person even remarked that they thought the house was too big. They thought there was enough room for a parent's family of 10 in one house. So maybe shows you how little expectation they had of the space that they would get within homes in Dundee. But a lot of people were very enthusiastic about the homes. Many women remarked they were extremely anxious that no time should be spared so that husbands could occupy them upon their return home from the war. So all systems would go. Things were looking promising within Dundee, and the government was going to give money. That had been agreed. So designs were being worked on, but the question is, why was Logie chosen as the first scheme? The answer is simplicity. As the land was owned by only one estate, then there were no legal restraints. It was easier to tie up. So you just needed to buy the one plot of land, and that was it. It was a relatively flat piece of land. There was nothing to demolish, or no allotment owners to rehouse. By November 1917, the city engineer was drawing up plans for the scheme, and the picture on the right, sorry, maybe it's left for you, shows you how the original layout was back in the 1917 report. You can see it's a very angular, the streets are very straight, there's a lot less streets, and all the blocks are perpendicular to each other. However, redesigns went ahead, and by the summer of 1918, this was the plan, which looks almost exactly like what we have today, with the curved streets and houses running along them with more space for gardens in between. And these final layouts were approved in July 1918, and the local government board, crucially, because they were handing out the money from the government, they approved the scheme as well. So everything was a go-ahead. This is a picture of the Logie area from the 1st of July 1919. We're quite lucky because we have a series of photographs showing the monthly progress of the scheme and how building was getting on. We think that these were taken as part of the city engineer's report to the Housing and Town Planning Committee, which a lot of my research is based on. And I'm not going to go through them all, but they do show a fascinating look at the housing scheme and also the surrounding area of Dundee. So you can see the roads have started to be laid out, but nothing had been built yet. You can see the tree-lined Bargate Road at the top and Scott Street here. Also interesting, if you know the area well, this of course is now a school. At the time this was the West Poorhouse, just beyond the trees here, and we have very few pictures of the poorhouse, so that's one of it that's not very clear to see, but it is there. So we go back to our rainy day in July, so the 4th of July. So George McRae, he's the man with the shovel, and he's turning the first sod, and he was presented with a ceremonial shovel, so a different one that he actually did the digging with. And engraved upon it was, and I quote, "At Dundee, 4th of July 1919, Sir George McRae, DSO, VP of Local Government Board of Scotland, turned the first sod on the site of the Logie scheme for houses for the working classes, this housing scheme being the first in Scotland to be proceeded with by a local authority in partnership with the state," which is quite a long inscription, so it must have either been very small writing or quite a large shovel. So the first order of business was to decide what the streets were going to be called. The first idea was to name the central avenue Victoria Avenue as it led up to Victoria Park. However, this was eventually dismissed because there were far too many streets in Dundee already with Victoria in the name, and they thought it could get confusing, which is quite sensible. The other streets were going to be named after generals and admirals from the war, including Kitchener and Hague. These proposed names were sent to the council by the Housing and Town Planning Committee, but were sent back and refused. We don't quite know why. As far as I can see, I can't find a report in the newspaper as to why this was. Whether they wanted something more meaningful, they didn't want to commemorate the war. I don't know if it was anti-war. It's possibly a bit too early for that. But either way, they changed them into more green names, which reflect named after trees, which reflected the green and spacious nature of the scheme. And that's probably quite sensible, really, when you consider you're putting war veterans into the homes. Maybe not the best idea to give them homes on streets named after the generals they had just been through a very pressing war with. So something else pioneering about the scheme, it wasn't only the first council housing scheme in Scotland, the heating scheme was also very unique. The aim of the housing scheme, as Thompson laid out in the 1917 report, was to make it as smoke-free as possible. Fires were to be kept to a minimum, and electric was going to be used for lighting the homes, which was still quite unusual at this time. To heat the scheme, James Thompson came up with a pioneering central heating scheme, which would run from the bathhouse, which is this building here. The idea was that hot water would be sent to each house via pipes. This would be a more efficient means of heating, and the idea was to give economy of scale. It would also provide a healthier living environment and having lots of fires within the homes. The boiler house and the bathhouse were sadly closed in the 1970s and now industrial units, but they used to house the first central heating scheme in Europe. So there had been a few of these in America, but this was the first one in Europe, so that's really something worth mentioning. Sadly, we don't have any pictures of the building back in the 1920s, but we do have a couple from the 1950s, showing that it was certainly very well used back then. You can see here a couple of women coming out with the children waiting outside, and then here we have a picture inside on wash day. There were a few stories at the time that on a Sunday, on Bath Day, essentially, it would be very busy, not only with the residents of Logie, but also all their relatives who lived elsewhere in the city would come over to Logie to make use of the bathing facilities. And so you can just imagine how busy it was. Okay, so here we have a picture of October 1919. We're a few months into the build, and you can see that some of the houses are starting to take shape. One of Thompson's key decisions was to build the houses at Logie out of brick. And this was not a popular decision, particularly with the local master builders of the area, who later said that it should have been stone from local quarries that was used. But nevertheless, they went ahead and used brick, which brought its own problems. Because the bricks weren't locally made, they had to travel 40 miles to get to Dundee. The first shipment was delayed because of the Glasgow Fair Week in July. And then eventually when they did come here, it was in the Dundee Fair Week. So the men on site were given a week off. So 2 weeks' work was lost. Then there was rail strikes, which mean that a shipment of bricks had to come by water, although they did make it, although I'm not sure what route they would have taken. And then there were following national strikes in September, October 1919, which caused delays well into November. So quite a lot of setbacks, really. In fact, the difficulties in supply of bricks and the fact that stone was actually cheaper by this point led James Thompson to recommend that any future developments be built in stone. And certainly I know the properties at Taybank definitely were. So obviously they did take on board the problems for future development. So now we move on into 1920, so 1st of January, Happy New Year, everyone. As you can see, it's a snowy January the 1st, and you can possibly get an idea of how smoky the city was at this time by this picture. Granted, it could be a little bit foggy because you can't see the Tay Bridge very well at this point, but certainly looking towards the city centre, you can't really see anything at all. As well as the problems with supply of bricks, there was also problems with the supply of labour, which is probably quite surprising considering that a lot of men by this point had been demobbed and had returning home from the war. And as a result, unemployment was actually very high across the whole country, not just in Dundee. The problem wasn't just getting hold of men, it was getting hold of skilled workers. Many bricklayers and masons had changed profession during the war due to the lack of work. So a lot of building works were cancelled due to the war effort. Men who were hired were not given long enough to train. And in December, James Thompson recommended that men be given more time to adjust because many were just being fired after a couple of days and not given proper time to adjust to the new working. So as well as national strikes, there were also strikes locally of plumbers, joiners and bricklayers in early 1920. And in June 1920, the plumbers went on strike after a disagreement with the heating engineers. Because there were lots of pipes going into these homes, particularly from the central heating scheme, they couldn't quite decide who should be laying which pipes, which, considering it was a pioneering heating scheme, probably isn't that much of a surprise. The plumbers thought they should be laying all the pipes above the floorboard, and the heating engineers would be laying pipes below the floorboards, but obviously the heating engineers, in the plumbers' views, overstepped the mark. And in the end, the plumbers were on strike for just over a month before there was a resolution. So yet more delays to building the homes. We do know, thanks to James Thompson's detailed monthly reports, how many men were working on site. Sadly, we don't know how many of each profession were working on site. He does tell us who is there, but not what exactly they're doing and how many there are of them. And we can see that over the first few months until the first homes were opened in May 1920, we can see the number of men on site is gradually getting more and more, probably as they're rushing to finish the first ones. And then it drops dramatically until more of the homes are finished, and then we just have probably the last painters and plasterers at the end, before the final homes moved into in May 1921. Now we move on to April 1920. You can see there's quite a lot more homes here, lots of roofs. However, there are a few still that haven't been built yet. You can see there's a couple of plots here which haven't got anything on them, and we've got roofless buildings about as well. The ones on Logie Avenue haven't been built yet as well. So there is still quite a bit of work to do. And as the work progressed, a lot of visitors came to see Logie, including in September 1919 we had George N. Barnes, who is the MP for the Gorbals. He was a native of Dundee, and he was actually a brother of one of the councillors, but he came to have a look at the new scheme. In April 1920, so during this month, the Lord Mayor of Liverpool was in town, and he visited, complimenting the fine situation of the homes. The delegates of the 1920 Institute of Municipal and County Engineers Conference, which was held in Dundee, visited on the 18th of June. Although they were more impressed with the machinery used for the building rather than the actual homes themselves. And we also had some later visitors after the scheme was complete, including the Prince of Wales in 1923 and the Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin in 1925. It was perhaps wise then that the council put in a viewpoint at the west end of the scheme, which is this construction here. It was unfortunately much lampooned at the time. People probably didn't see the point of it. And the People's Journal did remark, rather tongue-in-cheek way, that on the clearest of days you could see the Tay, but only with first-class eyesight. Now, you can see this picture. I don't know if it's foggy or just smoky, but you definitely cannot see the Tay in the picture. But I'm glad to say that you can, if you go and stand there, you can see right down to the Tay. You can see all the oil rigs, and you get actually a very nice view of the city. It's probably a lot better than what it was because there's a lot less chimneys spewing out smoke. We also had other types of visitors to the scheme, including lots of members of the public. They would just turn up on site and walk in amongst the buildings, between the builders, just to see how things were going on. There was no health and safety at this point. And there was one man who was so confident that he would be getting one of the houses that he started measuring up the rooms to see where his furniture went. I would love to know who that man was and if he actually got a home, but it takes some confidence to start doing that. So eventually we get to the official opening on the 27th of May 1920, and here's a picture from the Courier showing the dignitaries that were there, and also various members of the public in the background. To commemorate the occasion, a stone was added to the viewpoint, and we know that as part of the celebrations, the Lord Provost Sir William Don opened one of the homes with a ceremonial gold key. Sadly, we don't know which one it was. And we don't know what happened to the gold key. And then they had a reception later on to celebrate the opening of the homes. So that was it. People were ready to move in, but who would these tenants be? There was much discussed in the local press, including this article, this letter to the Telegraph and Post on the left, people saying that it should go to ex-servicemen, and certainly the local government board did recommend that priority would be given to ex-servicemen, widows, and then large families if no one else applied that fit that criteria. And this is indeed what the council agreed upon. On the 6th of February, applications were made available from the Police Treasurer's office at 95 Commercial Street. There was a queue waiting at 9 AM outside the office for people waiting to get application forms. We had just under a month to complete their application form and return it to the Police Treasurer's office. So the deadline was the 1st of March, and the Courier reported that on the 27th of February over 500 applications had been received. We don't know if finally submitted, but it's likely to have been much more than this. So the rents that were paid for the homes was quite a bit of a controversial issue. In the first year in 1920, the council suggested 6 shillings and 6pence and 8 shillings and 6pence for the 1-bed and 2-bed homes respectively. But the Scottish Board of Health wanted to raise them by 9 shillings each, so the price for the larger one would be 9 shillings and 3pence. But the council were not happy with this, and they dispatched James Thompson to the Board of Health to negotiate and managed to get the board to agree to their originally proposed lower rates. This was really thanks to the fact that they were giving consideration to ex-servicemen as a priority. But unfortunately, that wasn't the end of it, because in 1921 there was another disagreement. The Board of Health wanted to raise rents to £22 and 2 shillings for a 2-bed, and £16 and 18 shillings for a 1-bed, as they had been in 1920. They wanted to raise them to £32 and 15 shillings and £24 and 10 shillings for the smaller homes. That works out at a price increase of 45% and 48%. Which is quite the price hike. Certainly, if my landlord turned around and asked me to increase my rent by that much, I would be saying, "You're not having it, mate." So the council, quite understandably, were not happy with the price rises because they knew that many tenants couldn't afford it. They did try to negotiate them down, and eventually they agreed to rates of £20 and 6 shillings for 1 bed and the £26 and 10 shillings for the 2 beds, and this worked out at 24% increase and 18% increase respectively. So a lot lower, but still quite a price hike anyway. But still, some people did complain that these rents were too low, some members on the council, because it was estimated that for a 1-bed home of this standard, you could get £70 a year and £77 for a 2-bed. So you were potentially missing out on just over £50 on each rent a year. So as you can, there was some disagreement about it, but it was pointed out that even these low rates, which were agreed in 1920, are estimated to be out of reach once you'd factored in the heating costs and other living costs of about 70% of workers in Dundee. So the houses were gradually moved into after the 27th of May, and we can break them down into 3 batches. We don't know exactly when each house was moved into, but using various different resources, we can kind of work it out. So the first batch of 84 moved into within the first week, so between the 27th of May and the 7th of June 1920, and these are the homes marked in red. The next lot, the yellow group, were occupied by early September, and another 42, that's another 42 homes that were occupied by then. And then between 6th of September and the 6th of June, the final 124 were moved into. And by the engineer's report, the 6th of June 1921, all 250 homes had been occupied by this point. So the question is who were these new tenants? Unfortunately, the original applications don't survive, and we don't have very much from the council about the process of becoming a tenant. But we do have other records which give us information such as the valuation rolls and electoral rolls. The homes were supposed to be for the working classes, but we can see for the valuation roll, such as this one here, the jobs of the new tenants did not form to what we would call stereotypical working class jobs. They weren't very hard labour, so there's not very many mill workers and factory workers here. Around half of the first 184 residents had what we would probably call white-collar jobs, so office-based jobs such as post office sorting clerks or insurance inspectors. We had some technical jobs like electricians, engineers and printers, and there were even a few artists, musicians and an X-ray operator, presumably working at the DRI. However, these job descriptions do fit with Thompson's aim to provide cottage accommodation to the artisan class, to move everyone up the housing ladder, as you remember from his 1917 report. The rents, although cheaper than commercial rents, were still out of the reach, as I said, of 70% of Dundee's working classes. So many mill workers and labourers couldn't afford to live here. But what about the preference shown to ex-servicemen? It's hard to tell exactly how many tenants were veterans, mainly because most service records from the First World War don't survive. And in many cases, all we have to go from the valuation rolls and electoral rolls is just a name and possibly an occupation. So searching the records is almost impossible in some cases. However, out of the first 84 tenants so far, I've been able to confirm that 58 had military service histories. 47 were in the Army, 5 were in the Navy, 3 in the Merchant Navy and 3 in the RFC or RAF. Of those 47 in the Army, we know that 11 men were in the Royal Engineers, possibly showing because of their engineering background. 8 were in the Black Watch, 7 in the Royal Army Medical Corps and 5 in the Army Service Corps. We even had 1 man who was in the New Zealand Army and another from the Canadian Army. Both of them had emigrated from Dundee before the war, but they decided upon being demobbed in 1919 or 1920 that they would stay in the city where they came from, and in many cases they actually married local girls. So as most of the new tenants were ex-servicemen, as you can probably imagine, they were actually quite young. The average age of the men who moved in during the summer of 1920 was just 32.7 years. The youngest man was 24 and the eldest was 50. I found 65 marriages for the 84 tenants that moved in that first week. 18 were married before the war, 23 during the war, and 24 just after. So there were a lot of newlyweds there as well. It's likely that there were a lot of children and probably babies born at Logie within the first few years. Although it's difficult to tell at the moment until the 1921 census comes out. We do know, however, that 6 of the new tenants were women, and I know at least 3 of them were war widows. Again, I don't know how many children they have. One of them was Emma Bremner, who used her war widow pension to train as a nurse at the end of the war, and she eventually remarried and emigrated to the United States. 29 of the original 84 were born in Dundee, 8 came from Angus, 5 from Perthshire, 16 came from elsewhere in Scotland, 4 were born in England, and there was even an Irishman amongst them. And out of those original 84 tenants that moved in the first week of June, the last tenant to move out was James Bathy Wilson, who sadly died at his home at 6 Birchwood Place on the 16th of January 1963, after he'd lived there for almost 43 years, which is quite some feat for any tenant. After the first year in the controversial rent price hike, of the first 126 tenants to move in, 20 moved out the following year. That's about 16%. I don't know if this is a high. It'd be interesting to compare it to other rented properties nearby, say on Blackness Road, and see if this is a similar sort of change, because people did move about quite a lot as families got bigger and circumstances changed. So it wasn't just the rent prices that forced people to move. Some people changed jobs and needed to move to a different part of the city, or they left the city altogether. And we know that quite a few of the tenants actually emigrated to the US or Canada after the first couple of years. Some people did move out of their original home, but they moved into a different one on the Logie scheme, possibly in some cases actually swapping homes, either to get a bigger or smaller one, or perhaps to be on a different side of the street, who knows. Whilst doing research on the tenants, I have found a few interesting stories and photographs of the people who lived there in the summer of 1920. I'm just going to share a couple of them with you now. I won't have time to go through all of these people, unfortunately. The gentleman on the left in the uniform is Alphonse Nathan, and he moved into 41 Elm Street in June 1920. He was born in Dundee in 1892, and he attended Harris Academy. He was a member of the Belmont Swimming Club, and during the First World War he served in the Seaforth Highlanders, as you can see from his uniform. This picture was published in the Courier when it was reported that he'd been wounded in the right thigh by a gunshot, and that was on the 20th of July 1915. He continued to serve in the army until he was demobbed in March 1919, and later in September of that year he married Etta Levinson, who was an Edinburgh lass. He stayed in his home at Logie until 1928, when the family moved to Glasgow and then on to Birmingham and back to Glasgow, where he died in 1953 at the age of 61. And then if we look at the couple on the upper right, this is John and Maggie Cape, who were teachers in Dundee. By coincidence, I'd actually done a bit of research on Maggie for another project. A few years ago, a colleague of mine was looking at the Dens Road school staff picture from 1911 when the school opened. And we don't know who the names of the teachers were in this picture, but we managed to pick out Maggie because the brooch that she's wearing is the Mackay clan symbol. So we managed to work out that it was her. So we did a bit of digging into her background and found out a wee bit about her. So I also looked into John, and it turns out that he served in the Royal Garrison Artillery during the war. And the couple were married on the 3rd of July 1920 and presumably moved into the home pretty much straight away, because John had been given the tenancy pretty quickly. and they moved into 22 Elm Street, and they stayed there for about 10 years when they moved on to Kelso Street. John was originally from Alloa, and he taught at many different schools within the city, and eventually becoming headmaster of Glebelands and then later Rosebank School. And sadly, he died in 1945 after contracting a short illness. Fortunately, I don't have time to go into the other gentlemen. There are quite a few people we found in the newspapers for a variety of different reasons, either during the war or after it. So Logie was by no means a perfect project. There were complaints about the size of the rooms and the width of the corridors. Many at the time they were being built described them as pokey. People didn't like the fact that the kitchen came off the living room, and many of these problems were dealt with and changed in the upcoming developments at Stirling Park in Tay Bank, which was the new name given for Spring Hill. But Logie does remain the greenest and the most spacious of the early developments, although in the mid-1920s the council did move to building tenement style of homes, because this was really the type of housing that Dundee needed. It had been originally opposed in the 1919 decisions in Thompson's 1917 report. Eventually they caved in and started to provide the homes that the real working classes needed. However, Logie does remain a very popular place to live. As you can see, it's still very green. Those trees have come on fantastically in the last 100 years. That concludes the story of Logie, the first council house scheme in Scotland and indeed Dundee. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. There's been a lot to cover in the last 50 or so minutes. I will be doing a question for the question and answer session for the Abertay Historical Society on the 9th of December. And if you would like to take part in that, please find the link on Eventbrite. So I hope you can join us then. Hopefully I'll be able to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.